Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So for my last reading, I thought I might switch it up a little. I'm going to read about one of Luang Por Chah's disciples, from the book One Monk, Many Masters by Paul Breiter, chapter 5, starting on page 71. The chapter is called Ajahn Sumedho. I hadn't seen Ajahn Sumedho for about a year. While he had always been an impressive figure, it was evident that he had matured further since our previous encounter. Over the years, whenever I saw him after a period of time, he always seemed to display new facets of spiritual development. He was physically impressive too. At well over 6 feet tall, he towered over the ties and was bigger than most of the other Farang monks. And his strong, deep voice underscored the authority with which he spoke. He and I had inspired conversations on the walk to and from the houses during those 2 weeks I spent with him at Luang Por Chah. His words conveyed clarity and profundity in that uniquely accessible way of communicating he has. It was a great honor to walk in his footsteps as we made our alms round. I began to think that here was someone who provided a truly meaningful mythic figure for our times. He was a model that young people would do well to aspire to, much more so than any frenetic musician or poet. Ajahn Sumedho didn't go much for categories and standard Buddhist terminology, but he fit the bill for what the scriptures call dukkha patipada kipa binya, one whose path involves suffering, but who comes to realize the Dhamma quickly. Ordaining in his early 30s, the monk known as Robert Jackman had more life experience than most of us who took robes in the 60s and 70s. A native of Seattle, he served 4 years in the U.S. Navy as a medic, earned a Master of Arts degree, and was a social worker and Peace Corps volunteer, all prior to his ordination in 1966. Always something of a seeker and thinker, he told me he'd been a voracious reader. I used to sit in coffee shops and libraries reading books, and I finally started to wonder, what's the point of life if all you can do is read about it? End quote. He also had a religious bent from an early age, eagerly taking part in church activities, but as he grew up and perceived suffering in himself and all around him, he began to think that, quote, God must be a terrible bore and have a really bad sense of humor, end quote, to create such a world. When he came across Buddhism, he said, quote, I had faith in it because it told me I didn't have to believe in anything. After a year of practicing method meditation, he heard about Ajahn Chah. He went to stay at Wat Pah Pong, but chafed at the discipline, still wishing to be a hermit meditator. And after 1 year there, he went to live on a remote hill in Sakonakorn province. He became seriously ill, had a major breakthrough in his practice, then realized, quote, what a silly person I was. He made up his mind to go back and surrender to Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah didn't make life easy for his first Farang disciple. Luang Por loved to tell stories about Sumedho and occasionally jab him in the needle. As often happened, things reported to Luang Por got magnified, embellished, and recounted over and over. One episode involved eating som tam, the raw papaya salad that's made fiery spicy in the Northeast. Sumedho was caught by surprise the first time he ate it, with comical results. Comical, at least, Ajahn Chah, who, as the story grew, portrayed him picking up handfuls of it, stuffing it into his mouth, and catching on fire. Luang Por would imitate Sumedho smearing som tam on his face, like a baby trying to eat. Ajahn Sumedho believed he was generally respected by the monks because he practiced hard, but to the lay people he became something of a circus attraction, quote, like a monkey, he put it. All they knew of America in those days was from Elvis Presley movies. and they wondered why an American would want to come live in an austere forest monastery when he could be home, quote, riding a big motorcycle and singing and dancing in the street. I first heard about Ajahn Sumedho in late 1970. I'd been ordained for about 2 months and was still at Wat Pah Wong in Bangkok when the 2 monks, Santidamo and Suijano, came from Wat Pah Pong and raved about Ajahn Chah and Sumedho. I continued to dither for a while, but after meeting Ajahn Chah and getting increasingly frustrated by the noisy environment of the city temple, I finally summoned the courage to take the overnight train to Ubon province to see what life was like at Ajahn Chah's monastery. When I arrived at Wat Pah Pong, the monks were just getting back from Bindabat. I met Suijano and one other Farang, Dhammaguto, and then Sumedho came. Suijano introduced me to Sumedho, who welcomed me with an ear-to-ear grin. Sort of unmonk-like, I thought, having been around so many Dao types in Bangkok. I stayed for about 3 weeks. He was generous with his time, taking us to see Ajahn Chah on a few occasions and inviting us to his kuti for tea and conversation. There was something natural and unforced about his bhikkhuhood. He would admit that food could be delicious, that things could be attractive, but he had the wider view that such things are bound up with their opposites. He would say, quote, "It's natural to like sweet things. You give your girlfriend chocolates. You don't give her samal, a small sour fruit taken as a laxative and a frequent post-noon refreshments for monks in northeast Thailand, pickled in Ajahn Chah's urine." He had great trust in Ajahn Chah and confidence in monastic life. Being at Wat Pah Pong and experiencing Sumedho's presence and common sense, and of course Ajahn Chah's too, was very uplifting. I decided that after getting my visa renewed in Bangkok, I would return for a longer stay. A couple months later, I was back at Wat Pah Pong, just as hot season was beginning. Sumedho was at Wat Tum Sang Pet, and Luang Por was sending Farang there to stay with him. So after a few days at Wat Pah Pong, Dhammaguto and I, who had returned together, were on our way to Tum Sang Pit. Sumedho was sick with malaria, which was a recurring illness for him. A novice led us to his cave on the hillside. He was sitting cross-legged, wrapped in his robe. He greeted us, and we asked how he was doing. Grinning broadly, he said, "Not very well." That was impressive. He didn't look like he was suffering, just because he happened to be very ill. I had accustomed myself to the idea of life at Wat Pah Pong, even after a very short stay, clutching at straws as the mind is wont to do, and felt some security in the routine there. Now I was in a huge, mostly empty monastery, consigned to a cave and left to practice on my own. The first night's jolly meeting in the sala, with a full kettle of some steaming sweet liquid to drink, allayed some of the unease. But as the days went by, I would sometimes wonder what I was doing there. Ajahn Sumedho obviously loved solitude, but he wasn't the kind of recluse who got spooked by having to talk to people. We would often converse after the meal, sometimes outside the sala, sometimes on the forest path leading back to our caves. Some evenings we gathered in the sala or one of the caves. Most of us would have something to say about practice, recounting difficulties, insights, and opinions. But Sumedho was the one we looked to for the last word. He was just Sumedho to us then. Ajahn was a title reserved for inscrutable senior Thai monks, it seemed. And it wasn't until a few years later that we started referring to him as Ajahn Sumedho. On one occasion, he talked about peaks of inspiration and valleys of despair in practice. I think most of us Westerners were obsessively concerned with success and achievement. We expected our minds to be always clear, brilliant, and inspired, and felt something was wrong if we weren't always happy and making measurable progress in meditation. Instead, we were racing right past the real point of practice, seeing the impermanence of absolutely everything. And Sumedho may well have pointed this out at that moment, but my thoughts were elsewhere after hearing about the peaks. I I was starting to gain enthusiasm for meditation practice, having had a couple of months of markedly improved experience, and I began to think that I had climbed out of the valley for good and was sure-footedly heading to the summit. Sumedho also said something I didn't grasp for a long time. He said, wisdom is like space. We notice objects, but we never notice the space around objects, he said, without further elaboration. Sumedho started guiding my meditation, having me pay attention to the way that the senses worked, to get a feel for what my body was. He told me to do things like grasping parts of my body with my hands when I woke up, which had a peculiar grounding effect. Hands are for grasping, he said. We're born because of grasping. During his first year as a monk, the only reading matter he had was Yanamoli's Word of the Buddha, which he read about 100 times. He became convinced that the place to break the chain of paticca samuppada, dependent origination, was at the link of grasping. Dependent origination is depicted in that Wheel of Life painting that I had seen in Dhammarama's room when I was first studying in Bangkok. It outlines 12 links in the cycle of existence, beginning with ignorance and then ending with aging, sickness, and death, finishing with the statement, thus comes about this whole mass of suffering. He introduced me to one of his great loves of the time, the Wato or koan method of meditation, as explained in Charles Locke's Chan and Zen teachings, using doubt to open up the mind. Sumedho certainly wasn't promoting a lifetime of anapanasati. Anapanasati means mindfulness of breathing, being aware of inhalations and exhalations, sometimes focusing on the air entering and exiting at the tip of the nose, sometimes focusing on the rising and falling of the abdomen with the breath. It's a staple of Theravada Buddhist practice, and in some systems it can be practiced into the higher stages of the path, but that wasn't Sumedho's outlook. He compared it to learning to play scales on the piano, saying, you have to learn scales if you want to play piano, but that's not all you practice. He recommended doing 10 or 15 minutes of anapanasati in a session, and then switching to something more insight-oriented. Quote, just watching your breath can make the mind dull, he said. Samadhi, one-pointed concentration, came easily for Sumedho, much more so than for the rest of us, and that might be why he didn't place great emphasis on meditations that focused on a single point. He frequently pointed out the pitfalls of suppressing all mental activity and abiding in blank or blissful states. Quote, Ajahn Chah says it's like covering grass with a rock. You don't see the grass and it grows more slowly, but when you take the rock away, the grass is still there. Rather, he said, the aim of the practice was to uproot the root causes of suffering through developing insight. Samadhi is the foundation of insight, but concentration practice in itself can be a dead end. The koan practice, specifically raising the question, who is the one thinking and walking, eating, and doing any other activity, was effective, perhaps too much so. I started to feel like I was descending into the depths of myself way too fast. Everything was hitting the fan, and it seemed more than I could handle or even force myself to try handling. I think what was happening was that by questioning what went on in my mind, and by searching for a self or person experiencing and doing things and not finding it, the supports for habitual, deluded suppositions about my existence were getting knocked away. The usual reference points, even though they only brought me confusion and suffering, were being revealed as meaningless. In the long run, a good thing, but in the short run, terribly unsettling. Or to put it in the common parlance of that era, when actually getting a close-up look at the characteristics of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and lack of self as pointed out in the teachings, I was freaking out. One night after an evening meeting, I asked Sumedho if I could speak with him. We went to the dying shed and sat in meditation together for a while. Then I told him I was having a really hard time and didn't see how I could continue. Not that I saw any alternative, which was the most frightening part. He'd already related to many of us how he struggled in his early days, how he reached his own depths and finally let go. Now he was telling me that sometimes there was nothing to do but grit your teeth and bear it, and that was when it changed, which it always did. You were left with a deep understanding of impermanence that could see you through anything. Finally, he said, quote, "You wouldn't believe what it's like when you do let go." Because he'd met with great difficulty in his practice and come through it, he was someone we could relate to and someone to look to as an inspiring model of what could be. And I think it gave him real empathy. He always said that compassion comes from first seeing suffering in yourself and then realizing that others suffer just the same. Still, it seemed, there was no safe haven anywhere. Early on, before my self-exile to Bangkok, part of the forest routine that depressed me most and made me feel all alone, a vast and endless task before me without an iota of pleasure to look forward to, was sweeping the monastery grounds. In forest monasteries, there are lots of trees. In the tropics, trees are shedding leaves all year round, so there is a lot of sweeping to do. Working in silence is the norm, since sleepers are far too apart to be able to converse. Working in concert, sweeping on and on into the afternoon, and moving from one area to the next can feel like an orchestrated performance. And as clouds of dust rise and mix with perspiration, the repetitive movement, a full sweeping stroke with brooms that are often taller than the sweeper, can put you in a meditative state. As the ground is cleared of leaves and debris, it feels like the mind is being cleared. Ajahn Chah sometimes spoke of just this experience, but at that time I hadn't heard such uplifting talk and found sweeping to be a particularly oppressive form of drudgery. Ajahn Sumedho and I were probably not the only ones who initially disliked sweeping. Sometimes it was just the physical effort involved. Sometimes it was the feeling that I should be meditating instead of doing this. For me at first, there was also a sense of desolation, another dreary shore in a joyless existence, standing alone and scratching the dry ground. Talking about the daily life as practice, Ajahn Sumedho urged putting energy and mindfulness in everything we did. When you sweep the leaves, he would say, make it a meditation practice, or do it with mindfulness, not thinking you should be in your kuti sitting in meditation, or other party line statements. During my stay in Bangkok, I used to recall the misery of sweeping, and immediately Sumedho would pop into my head saying, when you sweep the leaves. But later, when I returned to Wapapong after getting scared enough to start putting effort into monastic life, quote, when you're cornered, things become very clear, as Trungpa Rinpoche used to say. The sweeping became something I even looked forward to. It was meditative, it was graceful. It made me feel like I was part of a harmonious group. We worked together until it was done. The monastery grounds and forest paths looked so wonderful, clean, and renewed. Yet even as you admired your work, the leaves were falling again. Ajahn Chah compared the sweeping to clearing debris out of the mind. He compared an uncluttered mind to a cleanly swept path, and he said, quote, so you come to realize sweeping is not bad after all. We sweep the leaves to make the monastery neat and clean, and we sweep the defilements out of the mind to make it neat and clean, end quote. Over the years, I saw Ajahn Sumedho every few months. His words were always to the point and memorable. Tall and upright, full of vigor and without hesitancy, he was a tower of strength. And he never seemed to put his own needs or desires first. Many years later, I realized that I had never seen him do anything selfish. Yet he wasn't trying to project any certain image, and he often spiced up his advice with stories of his own foibles and difficulties. He freely poked fun at the way he tended to get ahead of himself. When he first ordained, he thought, quote, I would be happy if I could become just a little bit better. If I could quit smoking, that would be something. He did quit smoking, and later on Ajahn Chah too decided to quit. He pleaded, quote, "Sumedho, you've got to help me." But as his practice progressed, he started thinking big. Once on a train to Bangkok, he was thinking he had realized truths that could help create a utopia, and he saw himself as spiritual advisor to the United Nations. His heart was full of love for all beings, but as soon as he arrived in the bus, he immediately became angry and irritated. Another time he was living in a cave and enjoying blissful meditation. He decided his profound insights should be preserved, so he started writing poetry. Quote, "After a while, it began to feel like the whining of mice, and I wondered if it would ever stop," he said of his writing. He was especially tuned into doubt. He saw farang after farang come and air out all sorts of doubts about themselves, about the teachings, about the practice, the teacher, the way of life. He had a take-no-prisoners attitude and was always urging us to burn our bridges. At the same time, he recognized that doubts did occur and couldn't simply be suppressed. So he recommended looking directly at them as just another mental occurrence, and even to use doubt, such as in the Wato method of asking, who is the one that's asking? But he could apply force when needed. Once, during another difficult hot season, I told him how one visiting Farang monk had told me that the body is the vehicle for practice, and if the living situation made it too weak, then one couldn't practice properly. He replied, "Warapanyo, I've listened to all these Farang, and they're all full of shit." Visiting Wapapong from the branch monastery where I was spending the Vasa in 1974, one night I had tea with Ajahn Sumedho in his kuti. He said he was becoming more and more dispassionate. Quote, "I'm not enamored of living anymore. I don't dislike life, but I'm not clinging to it." Being with him on such occasions usually put me in a meditative way, enabling me to see myself more clearly and feel a sense of detachment from what I saw. It was obvious that he spoke from experience and he transmitted something tangible. Maybe that's what is called blessing or grace. On one occasion the following year, at a similar evening tea clash, just as I thought we were ready to adjourn, Ajahn Sumedho insisted that I listen to him recite a sutta. It was on the topic of ditthi, views or opinions, and it took the framework of the Four Noble Truths. Views, the arising of views, the cessation of views, and the path leading to the cessation of views. After his recitation, he remarked that there must be some reason for it being presented that way, i.e., that views and opinions themselves, when clung to, are the cause of suffering. This soon became a main theme of his teaching. That night he also talked about the practice in general and meditation as the vital point. "And what is meditation?" he asked rhetorically. "Sometimes it's sitting there with a sick mind and listening to all the shit that's been accumulated over a lifetime." He talked about forbearance and going against the grain. Quote, "When your bladder's aching, you can just sit and watch your reaction instead of immediately getting up and going up to urinate." After a pause, he added, "Your mother would never understand that."